Most films end when the screen goes black, the lights come up, the audience leaves. Whatever the film intended to do is finished. But some horror films do not behave that way. They continue elsewhere in conversation, in discomfort, in the uneasy feeling that something has been introduced into the mind and never fully removed. These are not films remembered for their scares. They are remembered for their after effects. Audiences argued about them, rejected them, misunderstood them, sometimes dismissed them entirely, only to return years later and realize that the unease never actually faded. What lingered was not fear, but disturbance, moral uncertainty, psychological residue, questions that refused to resolve once the story ended. This video is not about what these films show on screen. It is about what they left behind. We are examining 15 horror films whose reputations did not settle with time. Films that followed viewers beyond the theater or television broadcast. Films that continued to provoke debate, reinterpretation, and quiet unease long after their initial release. In some cases, the reaction was immediate and divisive. In others, it emerged slowly, years later, when audiences began to reassess what they had experienced. These films did not rely on shock to survive. They endured because they unsettled something deeper. They did not end when the credits rolled. They continued elsewhere. 1. Messiah of Evil, 1973. When Messiah of Evil was released, audience reactions were uncertain and divided. Some found it difficult to follow, while others described it as unsettling without being able to explain why. The film resisted immediate classification. What lingered was its atmosphere rather than its narrative. Viewers often recalled a pervasive sense of dislocation, an impression that the film existed slightly outside conventional logic. This sensation persisted beyond the viewing experience, resurfacing in memory without clear reference points. As years passed, the film's reputation underwent reassessment. What was once seen as confusion came to be understood as a form of psychological persistence. Discussions shifted toward its ability to leave a lasting impression without providing resolution. Today, Messiah of Evil matters because it exemplifies how ambiguity can endure culturally. The film refused to settle into meaning, and in doing so remained present in discourse. It stayed with audiences by never fully allowing itself to be understood. 2. The Brotherhood of Satan, 1971. Initial reactions to The Brotherhood of Satan were shaped by hesitation. Audiences sensed something unsettling beneath its surface, but struggled to articulate it clearly. The film did not provoke immediate outrage or acclaim. What lingered was a slow-building unease connected to its portrayal of community and trust. Viewers recalled a feeling that something fundamental had been inverted without being able to point to a single moment responsible for that reaction. The discomfort emerged through implication rather than event. Over time, the film's reputation evolved into one of quiet cultural disturbance. It became referenced in conversations about horror that challenges assumptions of safety within familiar environments. Its impact lay in the way it normalized threat rather than isolating it. Today, The Brotherhood of Satan remains relevant because it demonstrates how horror can persist by questioning foundational social structures. The film stayed with audiences by destabilizing trust in what appears ordinary. It lingered by embedding doubt where reassurance was expected. 3. Crowhaven Farm, 1970. When Crowhaven Farm was broadcast, it generated little immediate attention. Viewers absorbed it as a restrained television drama rather than a defining horror event. There was no widespread backlash, and discussion faded quickly after its initial airing. What lingered emerged later, often through recollection rather than documentation. Those who remembered the film described a persistent discomfort tied to its themes rather than its execution. The unease came from ideas that felt unresolved belief conformity and the quiet pressure of social expectation. As horror discussions broadened to include psychological and cultural dimensions, the film began to resurface as a reference point. It was cited not for spectacle, but for the way it embedded unease within ordinary interactions. Its restraint became central to its reputation. Today, Crowhaven Farm matters because it illustrates how subtle ideological discomfort can persist long after viewing. The film refused to announce its intentions, allowing its implications to linger quietly in memory. It stayed with audiences by suggesting disturbance without insisting on it. 4. Bad Ronald, 1974. When Bad Ronald first aired, reactions were uneasy and restrained. As a television production, it entered domestic spaces unexpectedly, prompting discomfort that viewers were not prepared to process within that context. What lingered was a sense of intrusion. Audiences recalled feeling unsettled, not only by the film itself, but by where and how they encountered it. The boundary between entertainment and personal space felt disrupted. As the years passed, the film's reputation shifted toward cultural unease. It became referenced as an example of horror that felt inappropriate rather than sensational, something that crossed an unspoken line without acknowledging it. Today, Bad Ronald matters because it highlights how context shapes after effect. The film did not rely on shock. It lingered because it appeared where viewers felt safest and left discomfort behind. It stayed with audiences by violating expectations of place, not content. 5. The Other, 1972. Initial reactions to The Other were cautious. Audiences recognized its restraint, but many struggled to articulate why it felt unsettling. The film did not provoke loud controversy or immediate rejection. What lingered was a growing sense of unease tied to its emotional implications. Viewers often described feeling unsettled after the film ended, not because of explicit content, but because of the moral ambiguity it left unresolved. The discomfort emerged slowly, sometimes days later. Over time, the film's reputation evolved into one of quiet disturbance. It became cited in discussions about horror that unsettles through implication rather than spectacle. The absence of overt explanation contributed to its persistence in memory. Today, The Other remains relevant because it illustrates how unresolved ethical tension can endure. The film stayed with audiences by refusing to provide emotional guidance, leaving viewers to confront their own interpretations. It lingered by asking questions it never answered. 6. Symptoms, 1974. When Symptoms was released, it made little immediate impact. Its reception was subdued, and discussion around it remained minimal. For many viewers, the film felt elusive, difficult to summarize, difficult to recommend, and easy to overlook. What lingered instead was a quiet psychological discomfort. Those who had seen it often recalled a persistent sense of emotional unease that did not correspond to any single scene or event. The film seemed to leave behind a mood rather than a memory, one that resurfaced unexpectedly over time. As the film was later rediscovered, its reputation shifted. It came to be discussed less as a forgotten title and more as an example of how psychological tension can persist without dramatic emphasis. Viewers began to articulate what had stayed with them, a feeling of internal imbalance that resisted clear explanation. Today, Symptoms matters because it demonstrates how subtlety can produce long-term impact. The film refused to announce its significance, and in doing so allowed its effect to linger quietly in the background of memory. It stayed with audiences by never demanding attention, only by remaining present. 7. The Visitor, in 79. When The Visitor reached audiences, reactions were divided and often bewildered. Viewers disagreed on how to interpret it, and critics struggled to articulate its intent. The film's reception was shaped by uncertainty rather than consensus. What lingered was its reputation as an anomaly. Audiences remembered it as something that did not align with familiar categories, and that misalignment became its defining trait. Rather than fading, the film remained a point of reference for discussions about incoherence and interpretation. Over time, The Visitor underwent a reassessment. What was once seen as confusion came to be viewed as a source of fascination. Its refusal to settle into a single identity kept it alive in discourse as viewers continued to debate what it was attempting to achieve. Today, the film matters because it illustrates how cultural persistence can stem from disagreement. It did not linger because it was understood, but because it was never fully resolved. The film stayed with audiences by remaining open to interpretation long after viewing ended. 8. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. Initial reactions to Let's Scare Jessica to Death were marked by confusion. Audiences and critics struggled to categorize it, often debating whether its unease was intentional or accidental. This uncertainty became central to its reception. What lingered was interpretive discomfort. Viewers left with unresolved questions about perception and reality, unsure how much trust to place in what they had seen. The film resisted explanation, leaving audiences without a definitive framework for understanding their experience. As years passed, its reputation evolved significantly. Once dismissed as ambiguous to a fault, it came to be appreciated for precisely that quality. Discussions shifted toward its psychological aftereffects and the way it refused to confirm or deny audience interpretation. Today, Let's Scare Jessica to Death remains relevant because it demonstrates how uncertainty itself can be persistent. The film endured not by providing answers, but by leaving questions that audiences continued to revisit. It stayed with viewers by refusing to clarify what they thought they understood. 9. Race with the Devil in '75. When Race with the Devil was released, audience reactions were immediate, but unsettled. Viewers recognized its tension, yet many described feeling uneasy rather than entertained. The film provoked discussion not because of what it depicted, but because of the worldview it implied. What lingered was a sense of vulnerability. Audiences were disturbed by the suggestion that danger could be pervasive and uncontainable, operating beyond identifiable villains or clear resolution. The film did not reassure viewers that threat could be isolated or defeated. Over time, its reputation shifted from a tense genre entry to a cultural artifact reflecting broader anxieties of its era. Conversations about the film began to emphasize its lingering paranoia rather than its narrative events. The discomfort it created was not tied to a moment, but to an idea that persisted afterward. Today, Race with the Devil matters because it illustrates how horror can linger when it undermines assumptions about safety and containment. The film remained present in memory by challenging the belief that danger can be escaped simply by moving away from it. It stayed with audiences because it suggested that fear does not end when the journey does. 10. The Sentinel 1977. When The Sentinel was released, reactions were polarized. Some viewers were unsettled by its imagery and themes, while others found it excessive or difficult to interpret. Discussion centered on individual moments rather than the film as a whole. What lingered was a sense of imbalance. Audiences recalled feeling disturbed without being able to identify a single cause. The film's intensity did not resolve into a clear takeaway, leaving viewers uncertain about how to contextualize what they had seen. As years passed, the film's reputation shifted. Rather than being remembered for shock value alone, it became associated with a broader sense of unease tied to its worldview. Conversations moved away from isolated scenes and toward the cumulative effect of the experience. Today, The Sentinel is revisited as a film whose impact outlasted its immediate controversy. It matters because it illustrates how unresolved intensity can evolve into long-term discomfort. The film refused to fade because it never offered a stable place for its meaning to settle. 11. Don't Go to Sleep, 1982. Initial reactions to Don't Go to Sleep were shaped by its familiarity. As a made-for-television film, it appeared to follow recognizable patterns, and early discussion focused on its surface elements rather than its psychological implications. What persisted was not the story itself, but the emotional residue it left behind. Viewers often recalled a lingering discomfort associated with grief and guilt, even if they struggled to remember specific scenes. The film's refusal to separate psychological distress from narrative progression made it difficult to mentally compartmentalize. Over time, the film's reputation evolved into something more unsettling. It came to be discussed as an example of horror that intruded quietly into domestic space, leaving viewers with an aftertaste rather than a jolt. The unease did not demand attention, it waited. Today, Don't Go to Sleep matters because it demonstrates how psychological disruption can persist without spectacle. Its impact lies in how it embedded discomfort into familiar surroundings and allowed it to remain there. The film stayed with audiences not by overwhelming them, but by refusing to let emotional tension dissipate. 12. Cry for the Strangers, 1982. When Cry for the Strangers first aired, the immediate response was restrained. As a television release, it was largely absorbed into the flow of weekly programming and discussed briefly, if at all. Critics treated it as a competent genre piece, and audiences moved on quickly. What lingered emerged later, often in retrospect. Viewers who encountered the film again described a delayed unease tied to its emotional tone rather than its events. The story's violence felt abrupt, unresolved, and difficult to contextualize within the expectations of television horror at the time. Over the years, the film's reputation shifted subtly. It became cited as an example of how network-bound horror could leave a deeper mark than intended, not through explicit imagery, but through emotional dislocation. The discomfort came from how little space the film allowed for processing what had occurred. Today, Cry for the Strangers is remembered less as a broadcast curiosity, and more as a reminder that horror can linger when it interrupts everyday viewing without offering closure. Its impact lies in the way it refused to settle comfortably into the format that presented it. The film stayed with audiences because it felt out of place, and that dissonance never fully resolved. 13. The Child, 1977. Initial reactions to The Child were marked by discomfort rather than enthusiasm. Audiences found it difficult to discuss openly, not because of explicit content, but because of the implications it raised. The film was often described as off or uneasy without further explanation. What stayed with viewers was a sense of moral uncertainty. The film presented situations that resisted clear judgment, leaving audiences unsure how they were meant to feel. This ambiguity created lingering unease that persisted beyond the viewing experience. Over time, the film's reputation shifted from obscure to quietly troubling. As horror discussions broadened to include psychological and ethical dimensions, The Child was revisited as an example of a film that unsettled through implication rather than spectacle. Today it matters because it illustrates how discomfort rooted in moral ambiguity can outlast more overt forms of provocation. The film remained present in memory because it refused to guide emotional response. It stayed with audiences by leaving them uncertain, not about what they saw, but about how they were supposed to understand it. 14. Dark August, 1976. When Dark August was released, reactions were fragmented. Limited exposure meant that many viewers encountered it in isolation, without broader critical context. As a result, early responses were inconsistent. Some dismissed it as minor. Others found it quietly unsettling without being able to explain why. The lingering effect emerged gradually. Those who remembered the film often recalled its atmosphere rather than its narrative. Conversations about it tended to focus on mood pacing and a persistent sense of unease that outlasted specific details. The film resisted summary. As years passed, Dark August developed a reputation as a title that felt unfinished in memory. Viewers could recall how it made them feel, but not precisely how it achieved that effect. This ambiguity contributed to its endurance, as the film remained difficult to categorize or fully recall. In later reassessments, the film was viewed less as forgotten and more as unresolved. Its significance lies in how it demonstrates that a lack of clear impression can itself become memorable. Dark August did not linger because it shocked. It lingered because it never fully clarified itself. 15. The Premonition, 1976. The Premonition did not leave a strong immediate impression upon release. Its arrival was quiet, and initial reactions were muted rather than hostile. Critics noted its themes but struggled to place it within the horror landscape of the time, and audiences largely treated it as another obscure psychological entry. What lingered instead was a subtle discomfort tied to its emotional focus. Viewers reported difficulty articulating why the film felt unresolved. The story appeared complete, yet the emotional trajectory did not close cleanly. The sense of loss at the film's center felt suspended rather than concluded. Over time, this lack of resolution became the film's defining trait. As the movie resurfaced through later home viewing contexts, discussion shifted away from plot and toward its lingering emotional imbalance. The film came to be seen less as a conventional horror title and more as a study in unresolved grief that refused narrative closure. Today, the premonition is remembered not for moments of fear, but for the way it resists emotional finality. It matters because it demonstrates how psychological residue can persist even when a film avoids overt provocation. The film stayed with audiences because it ended without finishing what it began. Some horror films disappear the moment the credits end. Others continue quietly, persistently, long after the viewing experience is over. The films discussed here were not remembered because they frightened audiences in obvious ways. They endured because they left something unresolved. A question, a discomfort, a shift in perspective that did not settle with time. So consider this as you reflect back on them. Which of these films stayed with you the longest, and why? Was it the moral uncertainty, the psychological residue, or the way its reputation changed over the years? And which horror film do you think deserves to be reconsidered today? Not for how it scares, but for what it leaves behind. Share your thoughts below.